You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the 535th episode of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Welcome to the podcast. As y'all will recall, with the last episode, we looked at the change of command at the top of the Army of Tennessee between Joe Johnston and John B. Hood.
Rarely has a general assumed command of an army under more inauspicious circumstances than those facing Hood on the morning of Monday, July 18th, 1864. The Army of Tennessee was backed up to a city it had to hold, a fact that not only limited Hood's room to maneuver, but also his strategic options.
To his front, there was a confident, vigorous enemy force numbering some 95,000 men. Johnston's retreat across the Chattahoochee had removed the last major natural obstacle between those Yankees and Atlanta.
Two of the four railroads radiating from Atlanta were either controlled by the Federals, the Western and Atlantic from Chattanooga, or not in working order due to damage. The Montgomery and West Point, torn up west of Opelika by Rousseau's Union cavalry raiders. Then, on the day Hood assumed command, McPherson's Federals, swinging down east of Atlanta in the direction of Decatur as part of Sherman's Grand Right Wheel, they reached and cut the Georgia Railroad.
And with that rail line severed, Atlanta lost its importance as a rail hub for the Confederates, and the tracks running from Columbus through Macon became the Confederates' only remaining east-west railroad.
After July 18th, only the Macon and Western linked Atlanta and the Army of Tennessee to the rest of the Confederacy. If the Federals also broke that railroad, Hood couldn't remain in the city.
Much of the area's importance as an industrial sector and the city's significance as a supply depot had already been lost with Johnston's retreat to the outskirts of Atlanta, and Union artillery would soon wreck much of what industry remained in the city itself.
Almost all government supplies and movable machinery had already been removed and sent off to other places in early July, and most of Atlanta's civilian population had fled. In truth, Hood was fighting to hold a city that had been reduced to a symbol, since the place itself was no longer of any practical value to the Confederate war effort.
With the Army of Tennessee backed up to the outskirts of Atlanta, Hood's room to maneuver and strategic options were not only severely limited, but the army itself was hardly in shape to wage a great struggle with the Yankee host that descended upon the city.
Casualties, sickness, and desertion had reduced the Army's strength to below 60,000 men. Many Confederate soldiers who had retained their faith in Joe Johnston through the long retreat from Daunting were now demoralized by his unexpected removal and abrupt departure. Still others who regarded Johnston's Fabian strategy to be a failure also doubted Hood's fitness to command an army.
The Army of Tennessee also suffered from several serious problems in its high command, some of which were of long standing, while some were created or worsened by the present campaign.
Brigadier General William Mackle, the Army's chief of staff and a devoted friend of Joe Johnston's, remained at his post for the first week of Hood's tenure as Army commander. But Mackle clearly resented the circumstances of Johnston's removal and Hood's elevation to the post.
When he was relieved from duty on July 24th, after refusing to shake hands with the visiting Braxton Bragg at Army headquarters, Mackle spitefully took many of the administrative records from the Chief of Staff's office with him.
Hood chose as his successor Brigadier General Francis Shoup, the Army's chief of artillery, and the officer who had been responsible for laying out the defenses the Army had occupied on the north bank of the Chattahoochee, the Shoup Line. Then William Hardee, now Hood's senior subordinate, remained at the head of his corps, but like Mackle, although for different reasons, Hardee very much resented Hood's promotion. In fact, he soon made it clear that he wished to leave the Army to avoid serving under Hood. Hardee's bitterness seems to have been due less to any fondness for Joe Johnston than to the fact that a much younger officer, once junior to him, and whose competence he clearly doubted, had been chosen as the Army's new commander.
But Confederate President Jefferson Davis denied Hardee's request for a transfer. If Hardee had left, Hood would have lost his only experienced corps commander. Alexander Stewart, now the Army's third-ranking officer, had been at the head of Polk's Old Corps for less than 3 weeks and had never handled a force larger than a division in combat.
Serious personnel problems also cropped up in what had been Hood's corps. When Hood ascended to Army command, Carter Stevenson, the senior major general then with the corps, took his place. However, neither Hood nor the powers that be in Richmond regarded Stevenson as qualified for the post, so they selected Stephen D. Lee as the new corps commander.
But until Lee could arrive from Mississippi, they preferred that the corps be commanded by someone other than Stevenson. Hardee suggested, and Hood approved, the temporary assignment of Major General Benjamin Franklin Cheatham to the post.
However, as we've mentioned previously, most recently in connection with his role at Kennesaw Mountain, Cheatham's record was mixed. Beyond question, he was a hard fighter, and he was popular with the men of his division, which was second only to Cleburne's in quality in the Army. But on various occasions, it had been alleged Cheatham had been drunk on duty, and his overall performance as division commander had suggested that level of command was at the limit of his abilities.
And so, Cheatham's selection to command Hood's corps was based on his reputation as a fighter, his seniority, and the fact that the assignment was only temporary.
However, that's not quite the end of the story, because after Stephen D. Lee arrived and took command of Hood's corps, on July 28th, over in the deceased Bishop General Leonidas Polk's Old Corps, both Corps Commander Alexander Stewart and Wing Loring, his senior division commander, were wounded, and Hood placed Cheatham in command of Stewart's corps for about 2 weeks.
John B. Hood thus had to defend Atlanta with one corps commander, Hardee, who clearly resented Hood's elevation to Army command, and another corps commander, Cheatham, who was unsuited to permanently hold that post, and 3, Stewart, Lee, and Cheatham, who were new to the responsibilities of corps command.
Under such circumstances, normally the head of the Army would have to shoulder far more of the load of command than usual, but Hood's physical condition called into question his ability to assume a more active role in the field. Nor would the Army's chronically weak headquarters staff be able to take up the slack, even had Mackle, the disgruntled chief of staff, been willing to cooperate with and support Hood. And of course, even after Mackel's departure, the new chief of staff, Shoup, was inexperienced in that role, and so too was his replacement as the Army's chief of artillery, Colonel Robert Beckham.
And unfortunately for John B. Hood, the Army of Tennessee's personnel problems rippled below corps level.
To detail the pools of resentment and frustration that existed elsewhere in the Army would get needlessly tedious, but suffice it to say, having grievances, resentment, and command turmoil rippling through the ranks on the eve of battle, while nothing new to the Army of Tennessee, didn't make Hood's job here any easier.
When he assumed command, though, Hood had no time to worry about such problems, even had he been inclined temperamentally to do so.
Because with Sherman now on the move, conducting a grand right wheel by extending his left out from the Chattahoochee north and east of Atlanta, the Confederates simply didn't have time to allow organizational turmoil to subside and time for troops and officers to grow accustomed to each other.
With their backs to the city and with the Federals on the move, time had run out for the Confederates. Ready or not, John B. Hood and the Army of Tennessee would now have to fight the battle for Atlanta.
After John B. Hood rode to Army headquarters early on the morning of July 18th, Joe Johnston, at Hood's request, continued to direct Confederate movements, in Hood's name, for most of the day, while Hood familiarized himself with the dispositions of the entire Army.
Meanwhile, as we've said, Hood and the other two corps commanders, Hardee and Stewart, wired Jefferson Davis requesting that the change in command be delayed until the fate of Atlanta had been decided.
Not until late in the day did they receive the Confederate president's reply. His wire read, "The order has been executed, and I cannot suspend it without making the case worse than it was before the order was issued."
By the next day, Johnston was gone, and Hood had gotten a tenuous grip on the Army of Tennessee. Both the Army's situation and the task Jefferson Davis expected Hood to perform were daunting.
Hood had to somehow strike a blow that destroyed Sherman's numerically superior force, or at least crippled it to such an extent that Sherman would withdraw well into northern Georgia, if not all the way back to Chattanooga.
Merely to shove the Yankees back across the Chattahoochee wouldn't be enough. In that case, Sherman could simply hunker down behind the moat of the river.
From that position, Sherman could dare Hood to cross in the face of his superior numbers, while he detached strong columns to worry the Confederate flanks. No, to drive Sherman back and force him to abandon the present campaign, Hood would have to strike a major offensive blow. But during the Civil War, as we've seen, destroying or seriously crippling an enemy army in battle was extremely difficult, unless its commander made a very serious error or unless overwhelming force could be brought against it.
Obviously, Hood couldn't bring overwhelming force against Sherman's army group in a straight-up fight. Just as obviously, Sherman was unlikely to make a monumental blunder, so Hood would have to find another way to strike a potentially decisive blow.
Except in unusual cases, a Civil War army acting on the offensive had to maneuver for advantage if its commander hoped to gain an edge or force his opponent to abandon a campaign. Simply launching a frontal assault usually resulted in failure and very high casualties. Successful maneuvering, though, required accurate information about both the terrain and the enemy's dispositions, wise decisions by the commander, competent staff work, and sensible direction of tactical operations by subordinate commanders. Oh, and a great deal of luck also helped.
As far as luck, Hood believes some had swung his way when Confederate scouting reports received at Army headquarters on July 18th indicated that Sherman had allowed a gap to open in his lines as his armies maneuvered to the north and east of Atlanta.
As the Federals moved out from the Chattahoochee, McPherson swung the Army of the Tennessee far to the east to reach and cut the Georgia Railroad beyond Decatur. Schofield moved forward with the Army of the Ohio on McPherson's right.
As McPherson's and Schofield's columns advanced on the 18th and 19th, they veered off several miles from George Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland, which moved away from the Chattahoochee via Buckhead, more directly toward Atlanta from the north.
Had the Federals been on the face of a clock, with Atlanta at the center, McPherson would have moved around the dial clockwise to 3, Schofield to 2, while George Thomas was between 11 and 12. The gap between Thomas's left and Schofield's right meant that they couldn't quickly support each other should either need help. And so, after studying the scouting reports, Hood realized that he had an opportunity to strike a major, perhaps a mortal blow at a part of Sherman's force.
Peachtree Creek flows from east to west, passing some 2 miles south of Buckhead and about 3 miles from the 1864 city limits of Atlanta. George Thomas's advancing Federals would reach it in a line with the corps side by side and would therefore effect crossings at several points up and downstream.
Hood realized that if he could strike into the gap between George Thomas and Schofield and overwhelm Thomas's left after his corps had crossed the stream, but before Thomas had time to consolidate his position, then a reeling Thomas would be pushed to the west, farther away from Schofield, and be trapped in the angle formed by Peachtree Creek and the Chattahoochee.
Hood reasoned that with the creek behind Thomas's trapped force, the river on the west, and attacking rebels to the south and east, George Thomas's only options would be surrender or destruction.
Sherman, who had learned of Hood's elevation to Army command from an Atlanta newspaper, correctly surmised that the change meant an end to the Confederates' passive defense, and that he could soon expect some sort of aggressive move by the rebels. However, as usual, Sherman guessed incorrectly about the enemy's intentions. Sherman believed that since McPherson and Schofield were weaker and more exposed than George Thomas, they would be the targets of a Confederate attack, and so Sherman directed Thomas to detach 4th Corps and send it over to the left to bolster their forces. That meant on the eve of battle, Sherman unknowingly weakened Thomas's Army of the Cumberland at the very point Hood had chosen to attack.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is The Atlanta Campaign, 1864, Peachtree Creek to the Fall of the City by David A. Powell.
This is part 2 of last episode's recommendation, so there you go.
As always, you can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info about joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Brendan B. and H.A. have done recently.
A big thank you to them, and also to Joseph C. and Bill E. for their donations.
And that's it for this show. Thanks for listening. We appreciate you guys hitting play. Tracy and I hope that you do join us again next time. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.